Hello, welcome to the Quad City Woodturners. I'm Bill Hurt, the current chairman of the Quad City Woodturners. Before we begin discussing lathes, I thought it would be appropriate for us to discuss some terminology so that the new woodturner would understand exactly what we're talking about. There are several terms that you will hear people discuss when they talk about their lathe and the features that it has. The first would be the headstock. The headstock is typically at the left end of the lathe, and for this video I'm actually standing behind the lathe so that I can point out the features. When you're working at the lathe, you'll actually stand on the opposite side facing towards the lathe. The headstock typically contains the spindle, which is this part right here. It'll contain the controls, the start and stop, the speed controls, and typically we'll have the motor, and if it's so equipped, the VFD on the back. This is also the area that will contain the pulleys that are used inside the lathe to control the speed. When we talk about the tailstock, we're talking about this piece that is typically at the opposite end of the lathe and is able to be moved back and forth. The important thing to know about the tailstock is what is called the quill here in the middle. You will see this referred to as the distance the quill can travel or the ram distance within the lathe. So this is the tailstock, and this particular lathe has a live center in it. The other thing that you'll hear discussed are the bed of the lathe, which is this portion here, and typically that can be two pieces of flat metal that's used as the bed, or in some versions it might be more than two pieces, but that's the bed of the lathe. The term between centers that you'll hear when describing the size of the lathe refers to this point here to this point here. It's the point between the headstock and the tailstock, and typically is used to describe the largest piece that you could turn between centers. You'll also hear the term MT size, which almost every lathe these days is an MT2, and that's the size of the taper that is used for the accessories that go with the lathe. You might hear talk of an indexing wheel. That's typically on the back of the lathe, and depending on the lathe, it may or may not have that feature, but if it does, it's a wheel with holes drilled in it so that the lathe can be stopped at various points as you turn the spindle. Another important piece on the lathe is what's often referred to as the banjo. This piece can move back and forth along the lathe beds. This one needs to be lubricated a little bit. The banjo is used to hold the tool rest, and the tool rest is where you rest the tool when you're turning on the lathe. And so it's important when you look at that to know that you can put a variety of different size tool rests. This is a fairly short one here. It's only about 4 or 5 inches, and then this would be a longer one. And it really just depends on what you're doing on the lathe to determine which type of tool rest you want to use, the length and the height that you set it at. One important consideration with the banjo is that once you move it close to the headstock, if your piece is in the way, you may decrease the effective capacity of the lathe. For instance, this would be 16 inches on this lathe, but once you have the banjo interfering with the workpiece, you may lose 4 to 5 inches of effective diameter that you can turn. It's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at the size capacity of your lathe. As we go through this series of videos, it may seem like this is a commercial for Jet Powermatic. I assure you that it is not. We will mention other brands of lathes that I have experience with or that we know share the same features. It just so happens that here in the shop at the Quad City Woodturners, almost every lathe that we own is a Jet or Powermatic. Most of these lathes were donated by the membership, so we didn't have any control over the brand that was donated. When we did choose to buy 2 different lathes in the shop, we did purchase Powermatic lathes. I don't think you can go wrong with a Powermatic, but you also can probably not go wrong with any of the other brands. We will start with what is often referred to as a mini lathe, M-I-N-I. Typically, a lathe that's referred to as a mini is going to have about an 8-inch total diameter capacity and maybe a length of 14 or 15 inches between centers. This is definitely an entry-level lathe. It will typically have a 1/2 to 3 horsepower motor, which is going to be mounted underneath the lathe for a compact design. A unit in this size range typically will have 3 to 6 speeds. This particular model has 6 speeds that are controlled by a series of pulleys inside the headstock. There is no adjustable speed feature on this one other than adjusting the pulleys. Also in this size range, you're typically going to have a spindle here that is going to be a 1-inch by 8 threads. It could also be as small as a 3/4 by 10, but that's not a very common size to see anymore. There's likely not going to be an indexing wheel that's on the back of this so that you can stop the lathe at various points for your various treatments that you would want to do with it. It's typically not going to have a reverse speed, and it's just going to have a simple on-off button as far as the electronic controls. The quill travel at this end is typically only going to be about 2 inches. As for the banjo, it's typically going to be drilled for a 5/8 inch post instead of a 1-inch post that you'll find on most of the larger lathes. As far as weight, this whole unit's going to weigh around probably 60 to 100 pounds. Most of them are going to be in that 75 to 80 pound range. The cost of a unit like this could be anywhere from $300 to $500. Another important consideration with a lathe in this size range is that if you're not going to be placing it on a bench top, you'll need to buy an additional set of legs for the lathe. Those legs can run you anywhere from $150 to $250 if you buy the factory legs that go with it. Brands for a mini lathe like this are typically Jet, as this one is, Grizzly, Rikon, Shop Fox, and many others. This would be the entry-level mini lathe. This model of lathe is typically referred to as a Midi lathe, Midi being M-I-D-I. This is kind of a midway point between the mini lathe that we talked about earlier and then the larger lathes that we're going to talk about later. For a lot of wood turners, this is where they begin, is on a Midi lathe. A lathe in this size range will typically have about a 1 horsepower motor, 110 volts. Some of the lathes in this size range will have a reversing option so that you can turn the lathe backwards. Not that you're going to turn a piece of wood with it in reverse, but it's very handy for sanding. Typically, a lathe in this size range will have a 1-inch spindle, 1-inch by 8 threads per inch spindle, which is important to know when you choose your accessories like a scroll chuck. A lathe in this size range may or may not have an indexing wheel. And as I mentioned earlier, that indexing wheel is typically 12 or 24 points that as you turn the spindle, you can lock the spindle so that you can work on your workpiece. Within the headstock here are typically fewer pulleys than we had on the mini lathe. There's about, on this one, there are 3 steps. Sometimes it's only 2. And that allows us to adjust the speed range, but additionally, we're able to move down here to the speed control, and within that pulley system, we can dial up or down the speed and have a lot more convenience while we're turning. The on-off switch is also located down here, and that reverse function that I spoke about is also controlled on this same control box. The tailstock on this lathe will have a quill with about 2 to 3 inches of travel, typically more than what we had on the mini lathe, but not as much as what we have on the larger versions. As for the banjo, Typically on the newer Midi lathes, you're going to find a 1-inch tool post. This is an older model that still has the 5/8 tool post on it. Most of the modern ones that I've seen also have a 1-inch tool post. The weight of this machine is going to be around 100 to 150 pounds, so it's still fairly portable. It is important to note that if you're not going to mount this on a workbench, that you do have to provide legs with this one, just like you did on the mini lathe. Those legs are going to cost you an additional $150 to $250. I would expect within this size range that you're going to pay somewhere between $500 and $900 for a Midi lathe. The brands that are out there for this size lathe are very similar to the mini lathe. They're Jet, Grizzly, Rikon, Chop Fox, Nova, and Laguna has a new offering in this size range also with some interesting features on it. This is a Powermatic 2014 lathe. I refer to this as a tween. It's kind of in between that Midi lathe and the full-size lathe. This seems to be a hot category as of late, with Powermatic entering this arena, as did Laguna with their 15-inch model. A lathe in this size range is going to give you some interesting features, some of them that you'll find on a larger lathe, but usually in a more compact shape. For instance, on this lathe and the Laguna, they're in that 20 to 24 inch long range, which makes for a more compact unit in your shop. However, once you step up to a lathe in this size range, it's probably going to have a 1 or 1.5 horsepower motor. This particular motor on the Powermatic is only a 1 horsepower motor, but it's a 3-phase 220 volt motor that's been stepped down to 110 volt. And I'm not an electrician or an electrical engineer, but basically what that means is you get more power out of this 1 horsepower motor than you would on a typical 1 horsepower 110 volt motor. A lathe within this size range is typically going to have a variable speed control so that you can control that motor. Again, it's going to have a forward and reverse feature, that reverse feature being handy in sanding, as we discussed before. And then it's also going to have a step pulley system so that you can control that speed with each pulley, giving you a different range of speeds to use with the variable speed control. The spindle on this particular unit has stepped up to a 1.25 inch by 8 threads per inch, which again is a little bit beefier. It allows for a larger chuck, and it's an important thing to know when you go to buy that chuck or other accessory that's going to attach to the spindle right here. When you get into something this size, it may have that indexing wheel that we talked about, which is going to give you more stops as you go around the spindle. This one here, just guessing off the top of my head, is probably like a 24 based on the way how quickly it attaches itself. When you come down to the tailstock on this model, and the quill that's here is going to be beefier than what you find on that Midi lathe, and it's also going to have a little bit longer travel, probably in that 3 to 4 inch range instead of a 2 to 3 inch range. Most of your newer lathes also have a handy feature here where the quill is delineated with a ruler so that you can tell how far you're going. This is very handy when you're using a drill bit mounted on your lathe. When we come down here to the banjo that's on this one, now we're into the beefier 1-inch tool post. So this is something that's going to work with this size lathe or larger. And I think, as I mentioned, a 1-inch is more and more common on even a Midi size lathe. Another good feature that we have here that we didn't have on the Midi lathe or the mini lathe is it has a sliding headstock. So you can move the headstock back and forth along the bedways Why would you want to do that? Well, one of the reasons is to actually remove the headstock to make the whole unit lighter if you were going to transport it, take it out and do a public demonstration, or just move the lathe around in your shop. It kind of allows you to disassemble it further than you can, say, that Midi lathe that we talked about. Another nice feature is by moving this down to the opposite end of the lathe, you could then buy some outboard turning accessories and perhaps turn something even larger than the 14-inch capacity of this lathe. This lathe is, once again, heavier than the others because it's a larger lathe, but it's still fairly manageable in that 200 to 300 pound range. This lathe can be mounted on a workbench, or you can add the optional legs. And for this one, those leg accessories are going to set you back around $350, but most of them in this size range are going to have legs that cost anywhere from $250 to $400. The price that you're going to pay for a lathe in this size range, it would be about $600 at the very low end, up to a unit like this, which is about $2,000 without the legs. Brands that are in this size space range would be Nova, Laguna, Powermatic, and I'm sure there's others also. But this is what I call the tween size of a 14-inch lathe. This lathe is the Jet 1642. This is the first of what I would describe as the full-size lathes here in the shop. Lathes that are in this size range typically can handle a bed length or a maximum length workpiece of somewhere between 32 to 45 inches long. Typically, a lathe in this class will have a 1.5 to 2 horsepower motor. It may be a 220 volt motor, or it may be a 110 volt motor. Some give the option to wire it either way. Some will be dedicated as a 220 only motor. Some may also have what is referred to as a 3-phase motor that we talked about in the 14-inch lathes. Typically, a lathe within this size range will have a variable speed dial so that you can control the speed within a given range. It will also have a forward and reverse option so that you can turn in reverse, much like we talked about with the Midi lathes. The spindle on these larger lathes is almost always going to be a 1.25 inch by 8 threads per inch spindle size. That will be important when you want to choose your accessories such as a scroll chuck. Also in this size range, the lathe will likely have, if it's of a modern design, an indexing wheel, which is, as we mentioned earlier, a way for you to stop the spindle at various points if you're doing various art techniques on the lathe. Moving down here to the tailstock, the quill that is on these larger lathes will typically have about 4 inches of travel. The banjo on a lathe in this size range will almost always accept a 1-inch tool post. Some of the older version Grizzly and Laguna lathes actually had a unique size tool post that was slightly smaller than 1 inch, but all of the modern units, to my knowledge, come with a 1-inch banjo, or a banjo to accept a 1-inch tool post. Also within this size range, typically the headstock that is on the unit will slide back and forth. The benefit of being able to slide that headstock back and forth is maybe you want to do some outboard turning, and you can actually slide this headstock all the way down to the end, remove the tailstock, and they'll make accessories that go onto the end of the lathe so that you can turn a much larger bowl that would normally hit the bed. And once you're off to the end here, you have a lot larger possibilities that you can turn. When it comes to the weight of a unit like this, most of these are going to be in that 400-pound range, so they're really no longer portable. Most of them also will offer accessories such as wheels. The legs are going to be included with a lathe in this size range, so it's not going to be an added expense like it is with a Midi lathe or one of the smaller lathes. There are many brands to choose from in this size range, and the price is going to go anywhere from a low end of about $2,000 all the way to a high end of about $7,000. This is a full-size 20-inch lathe. This is the Powermatic 3520B. There is a newer model out from this one, but there are also several others in this category of what I call the Big Daddy lathes. These are the 20-inch or larger. Capacity for as far as diameter, some of them offer long bed options or bed extension options, so you can go out to maybe 52 or even 72 inches in length to turn something. These are going to have a bigger 2 to 3 horsepower motor. They're most certainly going to be a 220 volt machine. They're on the headstock here, you're going to have a variety of controls, which will be your variable speed. You're going to have your reversing function, your on-off button, of course, your readout for the speed. And I don't think we talked about this LED readout, but really any variable speed lathe is going to have that LED readout. And then within side here, instead of having the 3-step pulley system, you're really getting all of your power within a range of 2 different pulleys that you need to worry about. And on this particular model, you can turn as low as 50 RPM up to 1200 in that low gear, and then the high gear is 125 to 3200 RPM. You're not going to really turn anything at 50 RPM, but you might do some light sanding. Most likely you're going to lose that really low RPM for finish work so that you can apply your finish and have it slowly dry without any drips or runs as it dries. A lathe in this size range is certainly going to have all the bells and whistles like a reverse option. It's going to have that larger spindle size that we talked about, the 1 1/4 inch by 8 threads. It's going to have more stops on that indexing wheel. There's going to be more detents so that you can stop as it's going around. It's going to have a quill travel out here of probably at least 4 inches so that you can use that when drilling on the lathe. The more room you have here, the deeper you can go drilling. There's obviously a limit on how far you want that hanging out there for strength when you're using a center in the quill, but you do get more travel here. It's certainly going to have the larger tool rest size, that 1 inch that we talked about, and it's probably going to have a sliding headstock. This headstock with the motor is quite heavy, but as you can see, well, I can move it one way and a little harder moving it back the other. But it is you can slide it, and they do make accessories that you can bolt on to the end of this lathe. The tailstock on this model is going to be quite a bit heavier just because of its size, but many of the lathes in this size range offer accessories that you can mount here so that you can slide your tailstock onto that and then swing it away out of the way. Of course, that's an additional cost. This lathe is going to come with the legs, so that's not an added expense. It's going to be very heavy. This lathe is going to be in the 600 to 800 pound range, so it's not something that you're going to want to move around frequently, although they do make wheel setups for these lathes so that you can move them around the shop if you have a shop where you frequently are moving your tools about. This lathe is going to be probably in that $3,000 and up range, more likely $3,500 and up, all the way up to $10,000 or $12,000 depending on the brand and the features that you want. This size lathe is available in many different brands. We've had this Powermatic here in the shop for many years, and it's done us well. Any lathe in this size range, regardless of brand, is probably going to do pretty well for you. Okay, so today we have talked about a variety of lathe sizes from the mini all the way up to the largest model that we have here in the shop. I hope that you found this entertaining and or educational, and I hope that it helps you on your journey to choose a new lathe. We do have 3 additional videos that will be coming out. The next video will be on choosing tools. The video after that will be on sharpening those tools. And then the last video in this series will be the accessories that go with your lathe. Thank you.